After a long battle with cancer, Speaker of the House Ben Lujan died last month. His memorial services at the Capitol and the Cathedral Basilica of St. Francis in Santa Fe had a gubernatorial air to them. This was a man, remember, who wielded a tremendous amount of power over New Mexico politics during the last 4 decades, and then certainly as Speaker during this century. And John, let me start with you. You had a lot of experience with him as well. Lawmakers, when they return to the Capitol this month, not too long from now, as a matter of fact, what's going to be fundamentally different without him being there?
Well, I think there'll be a lot of things that are different in that the leadership style between Kenny Martinez, who's likely to be the new speaker, is different. I mean, I think that the speaker was kind of a traditional protector of the working people of New Mexico. In many ways, he was a traditional liberal, but he was also a very religious Catholic, for example. And so in his personal life, he was very personally conservative, very traditional in the way he lived his life. I think that he was also a very knowledgeable person in terms of the internal power dynamics of the body, being able to survive challenges to his leadership in a way that actually strengthened his power. But I think ultimately what will have changed is just on both sides of the aisle, and you kind of heard it at the Rotunda Memorial, where people on both sides of the aisle, it's always tragic to lose somebody before their time because he did die of an illness. He was strong as an ox. He's had the stamina that was truly remarkable. So we know that he would have been with us for a long time if cancer hadn't taken him. And that's why they're asking for donations to the Cancer Treatment Center, among other places. But at the end of the day, I think his record of service, he was the kind of guy, when I was chairman of the Democratic Party, he would show up at every Democratic Party State Central Committee with his wife, Carmen. He was always present in the public. You heard this in some of the eulogies, where he would force himself after being in session for 20 straight hours. He would force himself to go out in public and still meet with the public. And these are the kind of values, the civic values that we were talking about earlier in the show, that really cross party lines. There are people on both sides of the aisle that exhibit it. He was a prime example, and that's why he'll be so missed.
Sure. Laura, I'm going to get your thoughts and get some reporter stuff here in a second, but for Democrats, John mentioned a good thing. He embodied a lot of basic values that people have come to almost disrespect about Democrats sometimes. Liberalism, caring about the poor. People make fun of this sometimes, for gosh sake. But he meant it every step of the way, every day. He meant that every day. Interesting.
Right. Yeah. And I think his background, he was a worker. He was basically embodied the working poor of New Mexico. And I think that is a very particular perspective to bring to the House of Representatives, and one that we won't necessarily always have. And he just embodied so much of what New Mexico represents, the working poor. And so in that sense, it's a huge loss, I think, for New Mexico. But he also, he really understood, and I think a lot of people who didn't know him, were new maybe to the Roundhouse. I just remember having the reaction that he was just so old school and he didn't get certain things, but he really did. He got a lot of things that he helped, and he, in some ways, he was very traditional, but he also adapted very well. And I can say that from the perspective of the environmental movement. I mean, he really helped tremendously the last few years in terms of getting a lot of legislation passed that Richardson had pushed, and that a lot of environmentalists were wanting, and he very much helped the environmental movement and moved it forward in tremendous ways. And that was certainly part of the congressman's agenda also. But it was amazing to watch him work. And you saw, I think, interesting bedfellows, people who were very new to the New Mexico political scene, and then the speaker working together. And it was interesting to see those two things morph and work together. But he was just a master at what he did. So in that sense, I think he just touched a lot of people, made a lot of people's lives better.
Interesting. Would you consider him an open source for your press efforts? Was he difficult?
No, I got along pretty well in the 2.5 years I've been covering New Mexico politics with Speaker Lujan. One thing I liked about him, and there were some people, he had his share of critics. I mean, even among Democrats, there was Democrats that felt that he was too cozy with the Richardson administration, that he ceded too much control from the House to the Bill Richardson administration, that he used capital outlay as a hammer over people who didn't agree with him on things. But from a reporter's standpoint, all a good reporter wants from a source, from a newsmaker, is for him or her to be there at the bad times as well as the good times. Everyone wants to talk after they've got legislation passed or after they've won a campaign, But I remember just around the same time last year when we had the big Cheryl Williams Stapleton incident where she talked about the person on the fourth floor. And I sat in on a committee meeting hearing. I had my little trusty flip camera that I carry all the time, and the committee meeting hearing was over. Speaker Lujan knew what I was going to ask him. I was going to say, are you going to keep Cheryl Williams Stapleton on his whip? He knew what I was going to ask him. He did not duck. He said, no, I'm going to keep her, and this is the reason why. I asked him a couple of difficult questions. And that's all you want as a reporter. Right. You want someone who's going to be there in the bad times as well as the good times, and I don't have any complaints as far as on a professional level.
Sure.
I have with Speaker Lujan.
I never heard anybody complain about his manipulations or anything else of the press. He didn't use the press to get something out there to kind of jump people and stuff like that. I mean, he wasn't unsavvy about the press, but he wasn't,
right.
you know.
Yeah. As long as you put yourself out there.
That's right.
And answer the questions.
That's right. Yeah, fair enough. I remember, Jamie, a bit ago, we were here at this table talking, and you had mentioned this wouldn't be just your thoughts, certainly, that the Speaker wielded power in a way that some people did, in fact, come to question quite a bit. Right. And he was a partisan. What can you say? He was a partisan. But in hindsight now, what's your sense of it and how he carried his affairs there?
Well, I think even as a partisan, you can still be a dedicated civil servant and one that garners the respect even of the minority party.
Right.
And I think that's why you heard a lot of Republicans come out and say, look, this is a guy that cared deeply about New Mexico, served 40 years or more, and caring and working on these issues that were passionate to him. We may have disagreed with him on the approach to do it. We may have disagreed with his, the way he wielded his gavel. But at the end of the day, you had to respect somebody like him who dedicated his life to public service.
What always seems to me, you mentioned Kenny Martinez, possibly, is then he'll have his own, if this comes to pass, casting forward, he retires, people will be saying the same thing. Any speaker, you have to play it tough. Any speaker, it just doesn't matter. You can't be the nice person all the time. But what's it like to follow a 4-decade legend like this in that kind of a position? Is it possible to really just turn a page when these things happen, or does the legacy of Mr. Lujan hang on for just a little bit more than we might know from the outside looking in?
Well, I think on the core issues, I mean, actually Laura made an excellent point. I don't mean to suggest that the speaker was not adaptable. Sure. But I think that Kenny Martinez is known as more of a policy wonk, for example, than Speaker Lujan was.
Okay.
I would say Speaker Lujan was a guy who had a lot of really core values that I happen to agree with, and he was very passionate about them. And I think that your opponents can agree with that. Kenny is in some ways a person that we need right now in New Mexico, in part. So I'm very hopeful about his term.
Why would that be?
And that's because we have this persistent unemployment problem, for example. I don't think they're amenable to simple solutions. If there was some algorithm or some recipe that would get us out of this economic slump, I think any of us would be willing to adopt it. And so we're going to have to do some experimentation in government to figure out how we're going to get ourselves out of this. And Kenny's the right speaker for that. I think it's a great tragedy, and I think there will be a lot lost. But at the end of the day, I think that this will allow some new leadership to blossom. There's now new leaders on the Democratic side, like Antonio Mo Maestas, a former client of mine, who's a really bright guy from the west side of Albuquerque, bringing in some voices from the west side, the rapidly growing areas of the state. So I think that the future is bright for the Democrats in the House. And this is just one of these great public servants who we've lost, and it's sad.
There you go. Interesting. Thank you all for your thoughts on that. I really appreciate that. Now, we're on the clock now, running down some of the more significant headlines of the past couple of weeks. You may have missed them because it was a holiday. First up, Senate committee appointments. Incoming Senator Martin Heinrich landed on energy and natural resources. Huge. And New Mexico's senior senator, that's still in his first term, Tom Udall, senior senator, landed a spot on a key committee, Senate Appropriations. Jamie, holy moly, these are two not bad seats for our state. And it gives, are you relieved a little bit? Are we turning a page from the Domenici, Bingaman era into something else here with these committee assignments?
Well, it depends if Senator Udall really does use his position on the Appropriations Committee to deliver for New Mexico. I mean, people remember that he was a congressman and probably wasn't necessarily the biggest champion of the mission for Los Alamos in the way that Domenici and Heather Wilson were. So just looking at that from that angle, I think that maybe he has some something to prove here to see what he can deliver for.
Rob, I'm sorry to cut you off there. Rob, your thoughts on those committee assignments? Well, are they sitting pretty here?
Yeah, well, I think it's about probably the best that can happen for New Mexico, because getting those committee assignments, because if you're going to replace Bingaman and Domenici, who had so much seniority in that position, in those positions, you're not going to just step in there and be able to wield the gavel the way those guys did. So
Right.
at least with time, maybe these guys can earn their
Sure.
spurs.
10 seconds for you, Laura?
No, it's important to have a seat at the table, I think, in those two committees, and I think it's a win for New Mexico.
There you go. New Mexico's tourism department says the true, in quotes, among the fingers, TRRU campaign has been a success, returning on the investment to the tune of a 3-to-1 return. Full disclosure, John, the department wants to double its ad budget and hit markets like Chicago, LA, New York. Money well spent, or should we be trying something else? Are you okay with the numbers as they are being proposed here?
Well, I'm with some of these critics that have been frustrated about why we had to go out of state to produce these ads.
That would be one.
The amount of money, all of those kind of things. And I just came from the Rose Bowl where the administration decided to not do a float in the parade, which I think was a mistake, having now gone to my first Rose Parade. So I have a kind of overall disagreement with the approach that the department has taken in promoting New Mexico. And so I guess I'm a little critical of it.
There you go. Jamie, the numbers are gaudy, meaning a tremendous amount of people have come here from, what is it, Tucson, West Texas, and I believe, was it Southern Colorado? Was it town in Southern Colorado? Those three places alone seems to have accounted for Colorado Springs. Tremendous amounts of visits. Are you buying these numbers? I mean, it's an amazing
I'd like to dig a little deper and see if I think these numbers are actually, if this firm is actually doing the true analysis here. Not to play on words here, but I know, look, I disagreed with them going out of state and spending all this money when I think they could have done it here and told our story in our way.
There you go. We're going to hold you guys on that one. We'll talk about it afterwards. Lots to talk about. We mark another passing this week, unfortunately. Jake Martinez, the father of Governor Susana Martinez. Rob, he was part of our past. Is this part of the country, the love affair with boxing? My understanding is he was somewhat of a legend.
Oh, he really was.
This, I mean,
yeah, right after I got news that he had passed away, I spent a few hours on the internet and did some looking. And you go down to El Paso, everyone knows who Jake Martinez was.
Oh, seriously?
Yes, he's a 3-time Golden Gloves champion from El Paso in his youth. Then was a coach, longtime coach and trainer. He was inducted into the El Paso Athletic Hall of Fame back in the early 90s. I was impressed by just his resume, just his boxing resume.
Isn't that something?
And I was able to find a few photographs by scouring the internet of him in his younger years and in his middle age.
When was he a champ? In the 50s,
in the
early 60s?
1950s.
Okay.
He also was the All-Marine Corps boxing champ in his weight division. Also served in Korea. He was quite a guy.
Quite a tough guy is what you're describing. Down to 10 seconds. Your thoughts, Laura?
Well, I'm certainly, my thoughts and prayers for the family, certainly. But also, I hope that, he suffered from Alzheimer's for the past, I believe, 8 years. And I hope it brings some, I think that, it's always hard to have a passing in your family, but somebody who suffered from Alzheimer's, I hope that it brings some renewed attention to just everything that a family has to do and deal with. Having just lost my mother who had dementia also, and dealing with those issues is really difficult for the family. And I think New Mexico needs to bring more attention to the issues involved with caring for a loved one that has Alzheimer's.
Well said. Appreciate that. New news of a trip on an old route for Bill Richardson. Reuters is reporting he'll soon make a trip to North Korea along with Eric Schmidt. He's the executive director chairman of Google. It's a return to the international stage Mr. Richardson loves so much. John, I'm going to start with you again. Is this the only takeaway? Because it seems to me, and I want to be a wise guy here, but we've made a big deal of him going to North Korea many times in the past, and nothing really seems to happen. North Korea does what it wants. Bill Richardson or no Bill Richardson. So are we supposed to get excited about this again? I mean, what's going on here?
Yeah, I think that's a good point that you bring up. I mean, it might be a politically incorrect point here in New Mexico, but I think it's a good point. There's the North Koreans have been pretty much doing whatever the heck they've wanted to do. It's good for Bill Richardson. He gets his name out there again. But until we see some real progress on the part of the North Koreans, we'll just have to wait and see.
And some people, Jim, are not crazy about this visit at all from the Google guy. There's a lot of things going on with this trip.
Right. I mean, and North Korea is notorious for suppression of their people. Not only that, but then with internet suppression, this is just not the place for internet freedom.
That's right.
But I may disagree with Richardson's past travels as a elected official or whatever capacity he was. But as a private sector guy, I think we kind of need to have some of these types of dialogues with even our enemies.
Is this his true role? Gil Richardson?
Well,
international stuff is
Yeah, I mean, and I disagree with the lack of productivity. He's freed a lot of prisoners, even, and he's done issues with our prisoners of war from the Korean War. So the idea that his visits to Korea are he's really one of the only guys in the world that has a working communication with the Korean government. And
Fair
that's
enough
a
there.
hugely
Fair enough.
valuable thing. And I also think to say Google has been pretty good with, for example, the Chinese Communist government in not willing them to censor. So even Schmidt himself is not some sort of an evil character on the censorship front. He's actually Google is kind of a force for progress.
There you go. Sorry about that. I'm going to cut
No,
you off.
no
We're out of
problem.
time. Good to see you guys again. Feel better.